So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch of this year's democracy report titled Defiance in the Face of Autocratization. My name is Evie, Papada, and I am the Research and Policy Analyst at the V-Dem Institute. We are honored today to have with us Thomas Miller, who is the head of the Democratic Governance sector at the European Commission, to give opening remarks. We will then proceed with the presentation of the main points of the democracy report, Defiance in the Face of Autocratization, which we think will take about 15 minutes. And that will be given by Professor Staffan Lindberg, who is also the director of the V-Dem Institute, and myself. Then we invite our panelists to give their reflections on the report. We have the honor and pleasure to host 4 panelists this year, which I will name by order of appearance. So we have Thomas Carothers, who is the co-director of the Democracy, Conflict and Governance Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and a leading authority on international support for democracy, amongst other things, as well as a widely published scholar. With us today, we have also Boniface Dulani, who's the Director of Surveys at Afrobarometer and an Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Malawi. He has published widely on democracy and governance, often with a data of on people's perspective. Then I would also like to welcome François, who is a professor of international law at McGill University. Amongst other, he is a member of the scientific committee for the European Union's Agency for Fundamental Rights in Vienna. And he also served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of migrants between 2011 and 2017. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Alexandra Romantsova, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Civil Liberties and a Nobel Peace Laureate. Amongst others, he has, as he cooperates with the OCE, the EU, different UN sections, and the Council of Europe, as well as international human rights organizations and their associates to promote human rights. So thank you all for accepting our invitation, and we hope that the diversity of this year's panel will make for an interesting discussion on the topics of democracy and autocracy. I would also like to welcome those of you who are online with us today, and invite you to post your questions at the Q&A, and we hope to be able to answer many of them at the end, or also towards the end of this hour. So I would now like to welcome Thomas Miller to give his opening remarks, if Thomas is with us.
Yes, I think we have to wait for Thomas' comments till after the presentation.
Okay.
He's joining very soon. So we'll go ahead with the presentation of the report and have Tom's comments after. This year's report from the Democracy Institute, Defiance in the Face of Autocratization, looks at several aspects of the developments for democracy and autocracy in the world. It builds this year on assessments of over 4,000 experts and scholars from over 180 countries in the world and 31 million data. We'll give you the highlights of the five sections of the report, and in just 15 minutes. First section, Democracy in the World 2022 in Perspective. The average level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen is now back to 1986. Here's how the evidence for that looks. This is the Liberal Democracy Index, the black line in the middle, the world average, and then the different regions of the world. If we draw a line back from the level now in 2022, as with the red line in this graph, we come back to 1986. 1986, if you remember, was the year of the Chernobyl accident and the meeting in Reykjavik between Reagan and Gorbachev. That put things in perspective, I think. The region that's affected the most in these terms is Asia-Pacific region, but as you can see from the graph, all the regions of the world have steep declines over the past 10 to 15 years. This is our population-weighted measure that we focus more on in the report than the straight country averages, because we think democracy is ruled by the people, so it matters how many people are affected. And for the world as a whole, it doesn't seem to us that the advances in seashells, which are great, can really compensate for the declines in a large populous country like India. We also find that now we have more closed autocracies than liberal democracies in the world. Here is how the evidence look using the regimes of the world categorization. It's really the same indicators that go into the liberal democracy index, but just aggregated up to regime types. You can see that red line of closed autocracies that the world had many of in the 70s and into the 80s and declining over many years is now going up again. And we count 33 in the last report here in 2022. That's more than the number of liberal democracies, down to 32. In part, that is down because of a country like Greece, where that has significant autocratization and is downgraded to electoral democracy. To taking together these two types of autocracies in the world now account for 72% of the world population. That's a significant increase in the last 10 years from 46. And it's really all areas of democracy that are affected severely. So this is a graph showing different components of democracy, and we have indices for those. Clean elections, and this is in 2012, and looking at how many countries at that point they had been increasing in or declining. And with clean elections then getting better in 24 countries while getting worse in only 8. Look at how this compares with 2022. Boom. They are all below that diagonal line, meaning except judicial constraints really, meaning that they're getting worse in more countries than they're getting better. And worst of all, freedom of expression getting worse in 35 countries across the world over the past 10 years. And if we drill down even further into these components and look at the individual indicators, that V-Dem has over 500 of them, here are the top 20 that decline in the most countries over the past 10 years. Above that red line is the top 10, and 7 out of those 10 come from media, freedom of expression, and civil society. Those are the areas that are affected the most, and also often the first when countries autocratize. And then I'll hand it over to you, Evie, from here. Evie? Okay. Something happened there. Then I will... hello? Yes?
Hi. I was waiting for the host to unmute me. Okay, I can
Thank
see you all now. Hi. So in this section, we look at the world from the perspective of the direction in which countries are taking, so autocratizing or democratizing. A new record of 42 countries are autocratizing. So this is the highest ever we've seen in V-Dem data. Now, here is the evidence for this. The blue dashed line shows the number of democratizing countries that peaked at 71 in 1991. This was a time when the prospects for democracy in the world looked certainly brighter. The steep decline continues into 2022, down to 14. The red line shows the number of autocratizing countries since 1999. And it is accelerating up to a record of 42 by the end of 2022. Never before has the world seen so many countries in autocratization at the same time. So these are the countries we are talking about. So the greater intensity of the color indicates that there is more autocratization. So they are found in all regions of the world, and many are large, populous countries. And we now estimate that 43% of the world's population live in autocratizing countries, up from just 5% only 10 years ago. Many autocratizing countries are also influential regional and global powers, and they're also economically powerful. So that makes the trend even more worrying, we think. So, okay, which are the worst ones, right? So here's the top 10 list over 10 years, and then by the last 3 years only on your right-hand side. So on the 10-year top list, democracy broke down in 7 of the 10 autocratizing countries in the last 10 years, leaving only 3 democracies in 2022. So even among the top 10 over the last 3 years, 5 broke down already. So this really puts things into perspective. And what do these aspiring autocrats do to achieve this? We don't have the full answer to this, but this graph shows one of the findings discussed a lot in the report, in more detail in the report. So autocratizing anti-pluralist governments spread a lot of disinformation and use it as a weapon to stir up polarization. And then they take advantage of toxic levels of polarization to start derailing civil rights, media freedoms, and civil society participation. So we saw this when we saw Putin doing this in Russia already in the beginning of the new millennium, but also others followed suit, like Brazil, Poland, the Philippines, India, and the US. Over to you now, Staffan. Can't hear you.
Yes, let's look at the good news as well. There are democratizers still in the world, although their numbers have declined, as Evie already showed, down from 43 in 20 years ago to 14, and they're only host to about 2% of the world population, so they tend to be small countries. But in this year, we see something new. Previously, we had only seen really Ecuador and South Korea making U-turns, being democracies, going into a period of autocratization, and then turn around to revive democracy. We looked into this now deeper in this report, and there are 8 cases of such U-turns. Some going into electoral autocracy for a year or two before returning, others making the U-turn before democracy was derailed. And there are 5 elements that we can see unites many or all of these cases. First of all, large-scale popular mobilization, often orchestrated and engineered by a civil society. That's really been something that dominates several of these cases. Secondly, also judicial independence and action. That in the end, the judiciary stood up and decided not to bend over for the wannabe dictators and take action. Also a unified opposition. and their strategy, often coalescing with civil society, but pursuing a strategy of moderate, peaceful opposition to the incumbent, and using critical elections or other events such as term limits, end of term limits, to really turn things around. And finally, we also see that in a plurality of cases, there have been international involvement from the international democracy support and protection community that have played an important role. Finally, in the fifth section of this year's report, we do something new. We look at the balance of power between autocracies and democracies from an economic perspective. And here is one of the things, that the share of world GDP that autocracies account for has increased significantly, or more than doubling since 1992, when the Cold War had just ended. And this is a result both of autocracies like China growing their financial strength, but also of autocratization and more countries becoming autocracies. This also shows in trade. So the global balance of power of trade is shifting in favor of autocracies. And we know from the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas how important that can be. And the share of world trade between democracies that sort of is independent of that reliance on autocracies is decreasing down to 40% in 2022. Here is the more detailed evidence from another graph in the democracy report, where you can also see that the trade among autocracies is going up and has more than tripled. And also then the trade between democracies and autocracies creating increasing interdependence on between autocracies and democracies. These are some of the main findings of this year's democracy report, Defiance in the Face of Autocratization. It's available for download from our website, along with the dataset, the new version 13 of the V-Dem dataset and all documentation. It's also, all the data is also uploaded to our online tools that you can use to explore the data, even if you don't have statistical software and want to run them in R or another program. On this note, Evie and I say thank you for listening, and I hand it over to you, Evie, again. Can we have Evie on again, please? Okay, it's something with a technical glitch here, so I'll continue then. Without further ado, I want to hand it over to our panelists to provide your reflections and thoughts on the report and in extension of it. And I would like to first invite Thomas Carothers from Carnegie Foundation. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much, Staffan. It's very good to be with you, and thank you for the presentation. I'd like to express my appreciation for being invited to serve as a commentator. You know, last year I was a commentator at the launch of your 2022 report, and I'm actually surprised to be back because I offered some fairly critical comments. But I appreciate the spirit in which you took those comments, although I must say I don't really see them reflected in this year's report, but I know you took them seriously. And the fact that you're willing to hear from me again, because I do have some further comments that are a bit of more pepper in the soup. I think you described it to me once. So I hope it makes the soup more tasty. But let me start by saying how much I appreciate V-Dem's work. V-Dem's work is tremendously serious and well executed. And V-Dem has become an invaluable resource for scholars and policymakers all around the world. I use it. I think every serious democracy analyst uses it. And I salute you and your team for the seriousness of purpose and the excellence in execution of what you do. That said, I do have some issues here. And because I only have a short time, I'm going to focus a bit on criticisms, if you don't mind. They're not, I think, fundamental criticisms of methodology. Rather, they're in how I think certain terms are being used by political scientists as data, but then when you translate them to a public presentation of your findings, I think sometimes give some misimpressions. Let me explain what I mean. I have 5 points on which I think this is the case. The first regards the shrinking of liberal democracies. The report presents the rather alarming overall conclusion there are now more closed autocracies than liberal democracies, that there are just 32 liberal democracies left. So the reader thinks, oh my goodness, the world of liberal democracies is getting very small. Who's no longer in it this year? Well, Canada. Oh, Canada's not a liberal democracy? Portugal. Sorry, Portugal, you're out too. Austria, not a liberal democracy. Lithuania, no longer a liberal democracy. Greece, not a liberal democracy. You guys at the University of Gothenburg are pretty hard graders. I feel sorry for your students. You know, it's a very tough test to get into this club of liberal democracies if Canada is not a liberal democracy. In fact, Canada is rated lower as a democracy than the United States, which I think is going to cause a bit of a surprise among some Canadian readers when they view their neighbor to the south. So the first is in the way you use liberal democracy and say the world of democracy is shrinking because there's so many pure liberal democracies, gives a sense of alarm that I don't really feel is justified by the data. Second, the category of electoral autocracy. As you phrase it, everybody living in an electoral autocracy is, quote, living in an autocracy. Thus, you have the foreboding conclusion that most people in the world live in autocracies. And you put that in bold letters as a heading. So who's living in an autocracy? Well, turns out Ukrainians are living in an autocracy because they're an electoral autocracy in your report. So the United States and Europe thought they were defending democracy in Ukraine. Turns out Ukrainians are in an autocracy. Better call the White House and let them know that. Nigerians, who just had the election that the New York Times described as the most, quote, wide open election in many years, are apparently living in an autocracy. Filipinos living in the Philippines that had a reasonable election last year and have an elected president who rules in different ways, are living in an autocracy. This concept of living
Oh, it seems like Tom is having some connection problems from...
hits up against our policies. They think of an autocracy which, if you check the dictionary, says absolute power by a single person or a single party. The leader of Nigeria does not have absolute. Zelensky does not have absolute. The president of the Philippines does not have absolute. They are not the only source of power. I would argue that Modi does not have absolute power in India. So I agree with electoral autocracy as a political science term, but to turn that around in a public way and say all these people are, quote, living in autocracy gives a very different impression. Third, I find V-Dem's habit of making time comparisons, saying that we're back to this year or that year, it causes me a bit of analytic whiplash. Particularly, you say that Eastern Europe is back to 1980s levels of democracy. You know, if you look at the level of political openness and basic democratic procedures in Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Armenia, Moldova, Ukraine, and so forth, compared to the Soviet era 1980s and say we're back to that level, that just doesn't jive with common sense. There's something funny about the way you're presenting these things that causes an impression that I think is misleading. Fourth, I find the concept of autocratization very problematic in the way you present it publicly. I understand what you mean by it is any country that moves along this overall continuum is called autocratizing. But there's a problem in my mind when you say Belarus has been autocratizing. That I get. I say, yep, I see that. And that's the same word to describe the political process in Chile in the last 10 years, that Chile is also autocratized. It's also pink country. I'd say, wait a minute. If you had to use a single word to describe what's happening politically in Belarus and Chile, you'd say they're both autocratizing? Again, I think Chileans would scratch their head at that and say there's something funny about this report that puts us in the same category as Belarus. And then when you look at the map, Russia has been autocratizing to a certain degree, the same color as the United States. The United States and Russia have autocratized the same amount in the last 10 years. A lot of head scratching there. And you use the term in the report, this is a direct quote from your report, the United States is, quote, engulfed in autocratization. I feel you've lost a bit the sober quality that should go into a presentation of a report like this. I think most Americans would feel that their country is not engulfed in autocratization, but that term is a bit of an emotional term that I don't think is really appropriate to a report that is attempting to be very, very fact-based, as yours is. Fifth and finally, when you reach your democracy statistics and present them in terms of global balance of power, you use the phrase global balance of power and say that it's shifted from democracies to autocracies. The problem is the term global balance of power implies two blocks that are weighed up against each other. But wait a minute, Ukraine is over in the same block with Russia. So they're weighting against democracies. That's funny. India is in the same block with China, but India is the ally of the United States and Australia and Japan against China. And so this idea that there's this shift in the global balance of power because of your categories, you should be careful about extending a democracy analysis into a geostrategic analysis, because I think that's going to confuse people. So just to finish, I think you have an unusually restrictive definition of liberal democracies, which when presented a certain way can be confusing. Describing everyone living in electoral autocracy as living in autocracy is also confusing. Engaging in backward-looking comparisons sometimes distorts more than it clarifies. The overarching concept of autocratization ends up with strange parallelisms between, say, Belarus and Chile, or Russia and the United States. And using the term global balance of power is, I think, confusing when that has a natural geostrategic association, which is not borne out. But I take your work seriously. I think it's outstanding work. I think every kind of attempt to summarize democracy, one's going to always be able to pick at it. I'm trying to be helpful here in terms of how I think you present your information publicly. But again, I congratulate you and your colleagues on all the hard work that went into this excellent report. Thank you.
Evie, I think you need to unmute.
Okay. Hi. Hi, everyone. Okay. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you very much for those comments. They're well taken and well noted. And I hope we get some time to discuss this later on. I would now like to invite Boniface Dulani to make his intervention. Boniface, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Thank you. Thank you again to our colleague V-Dem for inviting us from the Afrobarometer to be part of this, I think, a wonderful, wonderful event. I should start, I think, by congratulating our colleague V-Dem for today's launch of the 2023 Democracy Report. I think, as Thomas has pointed out, I think we've come so used to using this very important resource, measuring and looking at democracy across the world. For those of us like myself who focus on gathering public perceptions on a variety of topics, including on democracy, the Democracy Report really does give us a very useful counterpoint for the, whether the perceptions of our ordinary citizens do match, I think, the views of the experts that study and understand democracy. And it is really quite exciting to see the similarities that are there between the Democracy Report and, I think, some of the findings from the Citizens' Voice, especially from the African continent. But before I think I weigh in on the report itself, I just also wanted to make note, I think, as an Africanist myself, some of my disappointment really that my colleagues on the African continent are not making use of this fantastic resource. I note from the report, for example, that only 3% of the data downloads are actually from the African continent. And I would like to urge my colleagues really on the continent to make sure that we tap in and make use of this rich resource that is available to us, not only as Africans, but also giving us the opportunity to compare where we as African stand compared to other global regions. I should start by pointing out how telling it is that the report, this year's report, highlights, and I'm going to look at this from the African perspective, highlights the fact that the African continent does have a number of countries, the highest number of countries actually that are considered to be democratizing, 5, but also the highest number of countries that are autocratizing, a total of 12. This is actually quite consistent with the findings that we also are seeing from the citizen perception surveys from the Afrobarometer, where some of the so-called leading democracies on the continent, the ordinary citizens themselves are beginning to tell us that, no, I think things are not going in the direction that we would like to see. And not with, for example, Namibia, Botswana, Ghana are singled out in the report as some of the countries that are autocratizing. And interestingly enough, we have also seen similar trends from the voices of the African citizens that are telling us that, yeah, indeed, some of these countries, Botswana, Namibia, Ghana, and also South Africa, among others, are, moving in the wrong direction in terms of the democratic trends. So this is why I said that this report does give us really an important counterpoint to some of the findings that we get from the citizens' surveys, because sometimes people do think, oh, ordinary citizens don't know much about democracy. But when we see similarities between the findings of report and ours, it does give us confidence that ordinary citizens do know a lot about democracy. But the fact that the citizens, the fact that some of our countries are autocratizing, we should not, I think, jump to the conclusion that the ordinary citizens themselves are also supportive of autocratic rule. We have seen, for example, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, when those countries experienced military coups, citizens went on the streets to celebrate. But what we see from our findings is that across the African continent, support for democracy among ordinary citizens remains very strong overall. What is the problem is the quality of the democracy. So on the demand side, we see our evidence supporting the view that citizens do support democracy, but it is those who are entrusted with governing that are letting them down and delivering a poor quality democracy. Otherwise, our findings do show so that there is still strong support for elections and democratic institutions, presidential term limits, among others, even if a number of leaders on this continent are actually going in the opposite direction from what the ordinary citizens are saying are their preferences. So I just wanted to really, weigh in a bit with that, perception, and just once again to thank V-Dem and maybe make a strong plea to say that, well, considering that citizen voices are matching with what the experts are telling us, maybe in the future we should also consider bringing in the voices of the people as we move forward with these reports. Once again, thank you for having me on this panel.
Thank you, Boniface. It was fantastic to have that people's perspective. I would now like to welcome François to give his intervention on this year's report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to comment. This report is extremely interesting, very well supported by in-depth research. It's an impressive endeavor. As a human rights scholar, I was particularly interested in how states' increasing resistance to the oversight of independent democratic institutions is a telling sign of autocratization, be they electoral commissions, universities, media, intelligence oversight mechanisms, human rights commissions, and many others. I echo Tom's comments and think there might be room for a middle category between electoral democracy and electoral autocracy. That might be something for reflection for the future. I would like to highlight one issue that might be missing from the report, and I would like to highlight it for future research, as it will affect the proposed rankings. I generally present democracy to my students as resting on three pillars: electoral representation, human rights guarantees, and the rule of law, which is capacity to obtain redress. The report uses the term citizen, and I have not seen it defined, citizen with a small c. It certainly includes the nationals of the country in question. It does not seem to include foreigners who are part of the population of the country and who can be permanent residents, temporary foreign workers, foreign students, retirees, undocumented migrants, etc., etc. Migrants are over 280 million around the world. They often represent a significant proportion of the population, 80% in Qatar, 10% in Malaysia, 7% in South Africa. They have often lived many years in the host country. The number of migrants is bound to increase due to numerous upheavals around the world and labor shortages elsewhere. In international law, migrants have human rights, the same rights as citizens, except for two: the right to vote and the right to enter the country. Migrants have the same right to access justice and obtain redress, but migrants are not politically represented. They cannot reward or punish politicians at elections. Therefore, they do not count in the public debate and cannot influence policymaking. In particular, they cannot influence migration policies. Those are made by non-migrants, the politicians, for the benefit of non-migrants, their electorate. Just like, not long ago, policies for women were often made by committees of men. The only mobilizable electorate on migration policies is often the constituency ideologically motivated by anti-immigration sentiments, and they dominate the public discourse. Migrants do not bring their lived lives as a reality check to public debates. A small proportion of those migrants have social capital and are easily mobile. We don't call them migrants, we call them expats. Most migrants have little social capital, live in precarity, be they undocumented migrants, temporary migrant workers, especially when these have single employers work permit. In both cases, states have constructed, it's a social and political and legal construction, a precarity bubble in order to force these migrants to accept labor conditions that citizens would reject, including low pay, and exploitation which is often contrary to the labor laws of the country. In most countries, North and South, millions of employers are exploiting migrant workers, and labor inspections do not protect them. Because of their policy-induced fear of being arrested and deported or blacklisted, and despite the considerable agency they deploy to support their families, migrants rarely publicly protest, contest, organize, or unionize. To give you an example, in some Canadian provinces, agricultural workers are legally prohibited from unionizing when we know that the majority of the agricultural workers are foreigners. And that's a violation of international labor law. Since the beginning of the 80s and the thickening of borders, migrants have been fantasized as useful scapegoats for all social ills: unemployment, criminality, pandemics, change of values, great replacement in recent years. States have deployed an extremely costly arsenal of security measures and institutions to guard borders against this migrant invasion, quotation mark. And we talk about biometrics, prosecutions, mass detention, pushbacks at sea, restrictions on the work of NGOs, security cooperation with disreputable regimes, think of Libya, and they resist oversight on those policies and practices, arguing security concerns. Unfortunately, these developing techniques can leak and affect citizens as well. Even in democracies, mass surveillance is being tested on migrants, but it is used systematically by numerous states on their own population. Hungary and Poland have demonized migrants, although not Ukrainians. Australia has excellent integration policies for the migrants it chooses, but an appalling policy of taking asylum seekers intercepted at sea to remote detention centers in Nauru and Papua New Guinea, where they're left to rot for years. This is only possible because Australia does not have constitutional human rights guarantees that individuals, be they citizens or foreigners, can use to judicially contest the legitimacy of a majority parliamentary decisions, like Canada and Australia have. Nor does it have the oversight of an international human rights tribunal, such as the European or Inter-American Court. Factoring in the treatment of migrants might change the ranking of such countries, North and South. In conclusion, I therefore posit for your reflection that the treatment of migrants is often a harbinger of autocratization, and in probably a less numerous cases of democratization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, François. It's very insightful presentation on the relationship between democracy and migration. I would now like to welcome Alexandra Romantsova, or Sasha, as he prefers to be called, to give her reflections on this year's democracy report. Sasha,
hello, colleague.
Hi.
Yeah, thank you. Hello. Yeah, I'm not a scientist. I'm just a practical human rights defender, and I'm from Ukraine. So now I can give my perspective and sure a question of democratization, or exactly falling democracy in whole the world, more important for Ukrainian society now, because Ukrainian society really deep believe that they are fighting for democracy values. And they know that we are transitional democracy. We know that we are young, but true in this way. I'm really supported by Tom. That was really painful. Read that we are autocracy. So I understood it. So I supported this moment that it's need to be communicated in some way. Maybe really include some terms like transitional democracy, or democracy in development, or something like this. I want to mention a really important understanding, and I see it's not only in Ukraine, but situation of war change a little possibility to exactly show some of democracy institution. For example, just example now in Ukraine, which usually we have a really transparent system of voting and working with new bills in our parliament. It's called Verkhovna Rada, but now it's totally secured, both when it's happened and what kind of topics putting. And I understood that it's usually showing that we are not democracy, but now it's one of the needing of security. So it's just one of example. I understood that same situation can be in any country which exactly have a situation around the war situation or some conflict. So it's I think it's really important in reports understood such points like derogation. So it's situation when country exactly wanna have some democracy values and democracy institutions, democracy rules, transparency, but can't do that because of some situation. But for understanding Ukraine, in derogation from 2014, because situation in Crimea and situation in Donbass was not influenced by Ukrainian authorities. But same Turkey and France from inside the use this process of derogation. And as for me, Turkey use it for exactly shrink any democracy institution. And so it's, as for me, it's really important to put this understanding, like situation of war, and because of this derogation, or situation of terroristic attack, and because of this derogation from country obligations, even when country told about that, we choose exactly democracy, and democracy, it's our main values, and we're fighting for this, well, like example in Ukraine. But I agree with the authors of searching in about this report, that it's true that Ukraine can be now calling total democracy or elected democracy. If we will speak about only elections, yes, elections work, but it's not work in the great zones in Donbass and Crimea, for example, where the election is not going because of derogation. So it's for me, it's really need to show this situation, because from one side, as for me, like a citizen of Ukraine, I feel that democracy starts to be more stronger here. But is it enough to put us from from category of potential autocracy to democracy? Maybe not. It's your own your own measuring. So you put this in methodology, but still, as for me, it's really important to show it, because in the main page of report, exactly Iran, and if you will speak about Iranian civil society, which exactly now fighting, they are fighting for possibility to have democracy, but as for me, it's need to be showing in some way. So it need to be showing that in some process, yeah, they still not have normal election, they still not have normal democracy body, but exactly that in some countries these fightings and society process started. And even in Belarus, if you will speak about summer of 2020, much important, like a move in the way of democracy than all what happened before 20 years. So I think it's really important to put it in the map of this reporting, kind of maybe next searching about this topic, to putting this huge like new events about democracy choice in these countries, because it's not election, it's a fighting for possibility to have election. So as for me, it's really important to show in this report, but again, not like a scientist, but first of all, like a practice experts, I'm really glad that we have this search. It's really give opportunity to look around and find the global patterns exactly. And one of them, and I'm really afraid it, you show it in like economic, depending between autocracy and how many autocracy now play a role inside the economic system. But it shows exactly, as for me, like it support my theory that even democracy state involved in process when they trying to find business partners who exactly not always democracy states. I mean, if Russia Federation have a cheap price for oil and gas, it's enough reason to have a business with them, even not look like they're doing with democracy possibility inside their own countries. So as for me, it's really important. It's really important part of this searching. It's this question about democracy, economic, and they involving both each other for main factors which created in this country. So thank you that you put this in this report. As for me, it's need to be even developed like a searching in the next years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And I think with that we have finished the round of panelist interventions, and I believe Thomas will not be with us, right? So we may perhaps continue with having a small discussion in the 10 minutes exactly that we've got left. Staffan, I'd like to invite you first to ask you if you have any direct responses to make to the panelists.
Yes, but being mindful of time here, I really want to hear one or two questions from the floor as well. I'll be very brief. I thank all the panelists for your comments and appreciate a lot, Bonnie, your perspective from the people and the ground in Africa, and maybe we should think of having a joint report. So we would have both the institutions and the people together. But François, of course, migrants is a tricky issue to deal with, and typically with democracy as being about the citizens or the definitions. But you bring up a really important area, and not the least because the autocratizers around the world often use migration and immigration as a stepping stone for their agenda. And so thank you for pointing out that. And Sasha as well, of course. And I think you also point to some of the difficulties I think for our many country experts that really provide the data. I mean, as everybody knows on this panel, I don't sit and decide how democratic a country is, or anybody here, but it's the 4,000 scholars and other experts. And it becomes very difficult, I can imagine, when part of a country is under occupation. And how do you rate the whole of the country and how much of, say, freedom of expression there is? Obviously, in some areas, there is none, at least not for if you don't espouse the Russian story. And as you said, no elections for a long time in several areas and so on. We can, Tom, of course, discuss, but I think one of the points for me that you bring out is sort of, okay, saying there's more complexity here than the story, at least maybe in the democracy report as a whole, and that's true. And I think the V-Dem data makes it possible to see that complexity, because if you want to drill down, if you want to look at the details of countries and the small differences, you can do that. And I think we also agree that there's also a need to take a bigger picture, and then you have to classify things into more sort of rigid categories, and 4 categories of regime types also means that each category is kind of wide. Electoral autocracies like Hungary and India with restrictions on freedom of expression and other things are different from a closed electoral autocracy further down the scale. There's a wide, like say Turkey, there's a wide range, of course. But and autocratization can start at different levels, and thanks for pointing that out. We try in the report also to explain how we treat that term, but it's basically any move away from democracy and having less democracy, and naturally you can have a process going away from sort of a perfect, if you like, ideal state of democracy that starts in a democracy or starts in an electoral autocracy and getting worse from there. And we discussed those different cases, and in some ways they are different cases, but they are all instances of undermining democracy in the world and democratic rights and freedoms, I think. But I'll leave it at that so we have time. I wanted to hear some of your reflections. We have one comment, question from the floor, the one that has received the most votes in democratically likes votes in the Zoom, about the point that you also discussed, both Sasha and Tom, about the shift in GDP and trade, and the balance of power as we talk about it. And the question is whether economic shifts drives the political shifts, or the political shifts drive the economic shifts. I think our sort of reason for bringing it in was really only to see how the empirics look like, with this sort of very recent experience in Europe and other places from what trade and economic dependence on an autocracy like Russia can mean, but without making any claims about one driving the other. But I'm interested to hear if any of the panelists here, Sasha, you already spoke to it, although, we seem to have lost Sasha. But then if François, Boniface, or Tom have thoughts about that. The economic strength of autocracies may exert autocratic pressures on democracies, ? Yes, Tom.
Well, again, it gets a bit to I guess what you describe as the breadth of the categories. The European Union has been increasing its trade with India in recent years. I don't think that's inflicting autocratic pressure on Europe. And I don't think that's somehow contributing to a shift in power balance away from democracy in the world. So I think you're right, it's a fact. If you sort of say Indians are living in an autocracy, the EU is increasing trade with India, there's a shift in, quote, global economic balance of power to autocracies, but I'd be pretty hesitant to extract much implication from that.
Thank you. Bonnie.
Thanks. Actually, I was going to make the same point, I think, as Thomas has said. We've also seen, I think, our fair share of autocratizers on the African continent that have also been, that have also seen a growth in GDP. Rwanda, Ethiopia, and these are sometimes being touted as development models, and with a number of people on the continent saying, let's go that way and maybe abandon the democratic trend. But look, Africa has also seen a fair number of autocratic regimes that have failed to deliver development. And we saw quite a lot of those, I think, from the independence era in the 1960s. So I'd also be quite hesitant at this stage to generalize just based on a few cases and say, this is really the way to go.
François, did you want to come in, or should on this question?
Just a small point. The problem with autocracies is the issue of succession and the instability, the ultimate instability of the regime, which is problematic for business. And we've seen when there are wobbles in the rule that suddenly businesses are, and we've seen that, for example, with Russia, since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, people are moving their assets out of Russia. And we've seen that there are hesitations, about continuing to work deeply into China as well. So the connection is important, but we have to remember that autocracies end, or at least are transformed, often, not peacefully. And that is an asset that democracies will retain. They are not necessarily permanent, but they have more peaceful transfer of power, and that has an impact on investors, business people, entrepreneurs, etc.
All right. Thank you. Evie, did you have any reflections? We have 1 minute left.
Yes, we only have 1 minute left. If had we had the time, I would have really liked the panelists to drill a little bit more into the question of, we've seen what the highest indicators in autocratizing countries are, such as attacks to freedom of expression in media and civil society. And it would have been fantastic to have a little bit more discussion on how these kind of risks these bring up for vulnerable groups in society, such as migrants or undocumented people, or people who live in war situations and so on. But yeah, hopefully we can get a research grant and look into that at some point. But thank you all very much for this fantastic discussion.
Yes, thanks to all our panelists, and thank you, Evie, for steering us, and thanks for all who have been participating here in the Zoom or watching us online on Facebook or YouTube. And we hope to see you soon again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.